Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Friends of the Dar, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Tonight's discussion centers on the prestigious collection of the Wallace Collection in London. Well known for its extensive range of historic Islamic military objects, the museum has been a national museum since 1990. al-Athar al-Islamiyyah is most honored to present Mr. Arthur Bijl, who is the Houghton McRoberts Assistant Curator of Ottoman, Middle Eastern, and Asian Arts and Armour at the Wallace Collection. He is currently working on an important catalogue of these objects, which are also the subject of his lecture, entitled Princely Arms and Armour in the Wallace Collection. As the catalogue of Mr. Bijl's producing is due to be published in October 2023, this evening's presentation of the collection's exquisitely fashioned pieces is a sort of a preview for the Dar's audience, as well as an opportunity to enjoy these objects before publication. As most of the contents that are the subject of this lecture were not accessed by the collection until mid-19th century, which of course predates your mobile phones, making them useless. So let's try to make them useless during this lecture, and let's welcome Mr. Arthur Bijl.
Thank you so much for having me here. I'm very excited to talk about the objects in the Wallace Collection. I'm going to take you through a few things. I want to introduce the collection, first of all, the Wallace Collection, and then I want to talk a little bit about the subject of Arms and Armour as well, like how we study it and how it's been studied in the past, so how we got to essentially our current understanding. And then I'm going to show a few highlights from the collection, never really been published before in any major way, just to kind of give you a taste of what we have and what's going to be in our catalogue from next year. So at the Wallace Collection, we have two curators of Arms and Armour. There's myself, of course, and my colleague in European Arms and Armour. And it's really, as a collection, it's about half-half in terms of what we have. I'm obviously not going to talk about the European stuff, but I do want to kind of make you aware of that to give some sort of context to what I'm presenting. And then kind of after all of that, I also want to talk a little bit about Arms and Armour in a devotional context, which I think is something that doesn't really get talked about very much, and also provides essentially kind of a counterpoint to seeing Arms and Armour as just weapons of war or kind of objects of violence, which I think really doesn't do justice to Arms and Armour as a category. So I want to tell you a little bit about the Wallace Collection itself first. It opened as a national museum in the year 1900, and it's based on the cumulative art collection of the first four Marquises of Hertford, and then Sir Richard Wallace, who is the alleged illegitimate child of the fourth Marquis of Hertford. And when he died, his widow inherited the collection, and when she died 7 years later, she gifted it to the nation, the British nation rather, and it was turned into a museum, which opened its doors in 1900, as I mentioned. So that's quite a long period of time of collecting, and the first big component of the Wallace Collection's collection history is really around the time of the French Revolution, when a lot of the art from the French aristocracy was sold off, and the Marquis of Hertford was one of the main buyers, essentially. So as a result, the collection is extremely strong in kind of 18th century French Rococo, for example, and also contains quite a lot of old masters, which were acquired kind of in subsequent years. But the Arms and Armour, specifically the non-European Arms and Armour, which has traditionally been called kind of the Oriental Arms and Armour within the collection, that was all acquired from roughly 1858 to 1870, and it was mostly collected by the fourth Marquis of Hertford. Sometimes himself, sometimes he was in the auction room, but quite often he bought through his agents. And it was mostly acquired also in Paris and in London, mostly in Paris, which is where they were resident. And also, it wasn't actually specifically collected to be in Hartford House, which is where the Wallace Collection is now, but rather spread out over their various holdings or houses. What is quite interesting, I think, about the Fourth Marquess of Hartford and Sir Richard Wallace is that neither of them were really military men. They weren't colonial men in the kind of the traditional sense. They did not work for the East India Company. They did not work within the British Raj. And of course, that contrasts with a lot of founders of British collections of Islamic art more widely, but especially Indian art, of course, which, of course, Britain is very, very rich in. And the fortune of the family instead derives mostly from their landholding in especially Northern Ireland, but kind of across the UK. And here we have 3 photographs, actually. They're dated, as you can see here, 1890, 1897, and sometime before 1900. We don't really know when these photographs were taken. These are kind of based on our best guesses and about kind of records that we have of photographers being brought in to photograph the collection. And what we see on the left is the European arms and armour. You can see the kind of the German and Italian suits of armour. And these were added later. So these were added to the collection kind of after 1870 when Sir Richard Wallace was in charge, essentially. And here we have the non-European, or the Oriental, as it was called at the time, setups, really. This is from when Lady Wallace was still alive, or just died. She died in 1897. And this is before the museum opened, but already kind of set up in a museum, as you can see by the cases. There are 2 things I want to draw your attention to. The first is, in these house photos, the priority is clearly given to a very decorative display of the arms and armour. This is not a display, as you would see, for example, with Augustus Pitt Rivers, who very much was this kind of colonial man, who really groups objects by ethnicity, by kind of scientific, region of origin, typology, kind of scientific categories. This is very much the work of an art collector, I think. And secondly, I want to draw your attention to the fact that very clearly here, the works of the arms and armour from Europe, Western Europe specifically, and the ones from Asia, but also Eastern Europe, kind of the Ottoman Empire, are very clearly split. And a notable feature here is that the European armour was housed in the western wing of the house, and the Oriental armour was housed in the eastern wing of the house. So this is quite a conscious choice, I think, on the part of Sir Richard Wallace. But even in that context, I think it's worth noting that because the 2 collections, the so-called Oriental armour and the European armour, were collected at 2 different times, kind of consecutively with very little overlap. While they're displayed like this, this seems to be very much the choice of Sir Richard Wallace, and it's very unlikely that the Fourth Marquess has any kind of division like this in mind. So that's the Wallace Collection as it was back then. I now want to talk a little bit about what is Islamic arms and armour. What does it mean as a category? And first of all, I'm sure many people are already kind of aware of this important distinction, but what we conventionally call Islamic arms and armour, and this also applies to Islamic art more generally, is that this doesn't necessarily mean works of art created by Muslims. It's quite often, it basically just entails any work of art created in kind of Muslim land or Islamic lands, as they're typically referred to. In fact, we're going to see a work of arms and armour later, a helmet, beautiful mid-19th century from Isfahan, and made by a Christian armourer there. So especially in regions where Islam was a minority religion, such as the Balkans or the Caucasus, and of course India, you find that quite a lot of the craftsmen are from local religions as well. And geographically, I'm really just going to focus on kind of the core Islamic lands, Iran, India, the Ottoman Empire. And although we actually do have some beautiful swords from Java and Sumatra, for example. They're a very small part of our collection. We have almost 1,000 works of so-called Oriental arms and armor, and from the top of my head, 5 of those are from the archipelago. And also the catalog actually that I'm working on focuses exclusively on India, Iran, the Ottoman Empire as a kind of very diverse region, but still one that kind of makes sense as a single like super region. And when we go through the objects, you'll see how evident it is that fashions in one area quite quickly spread across that area. So yeah, we'll see a little bit about that as well. And another note that kind of applies to the Wallace Collection as a collection of objects, but also to the study of Islamic arms and armor in general, is that I'm really just going to cover the late 15th century, the very late 15th century indeed, to the 19th century. Medieval arms and armor is a very, very interesting subject, but unfortunately there's very, very little surviving material. And what does survive is almost always corroded, it's quite partial, it's a very different skill to get a lot of information out of them. And we don't have any of that in the Wallace Collection. I think that's also, it also reflects the collecting habits of the fourth Marquess and Sir Richard Wallace, who, as art collectors first, were particularly interested in the beautiful, and they were not interested at all in anything corroded or anything kind of in a more, archaeological state of existence. We have some objects with corrosion, and unfortunately, that's actually our fault. They were stored improperly during the Second World War, and they acquired some corrosion. But historically, the collection has always been pristine, essentially. So as a result, the study of medieval arms and armor is very much focused also on textual sources. I'm not really going to touch on that. By contrast, focusing on the 18th and 19th century, I think gives us a really nice, well-rounded idea of what arms and armor is, the impact it kind of has on society at the time, and how it kind of fits into broader art history, which is something I'm very interested in. So having said all that, I want to look at arms and armor specifically, and I want to talk a little bit about arms and armor as a field of study. And it emerges in England in around the middle of the 19th century, with publications like the one I've got here on the screen. This came out in 1854, and it is one of the earliest published catalogues of arms and armor at all within kind of the English language. You'll see by the title also that there's no particular effort being made to distinguish European arms and armor from non-European arms and armor in a broader sense. This covers everything, essentially. And although this, despite that, this catalogue does function on a very standard 19th century idea that non-European works of art kind of reflect earlier stages of civilization, essentially. So that's a very kind of imperial European idea. And you do see that reflected in the text, but it is still, there's no sense of a clear segregation between Europe and everything else, essentially. And so quite often, actually, non-European arms and armor from the 19th century, mid-19th century, so essentially contemporary to this book, will often be described as ancient just because it's kind of foreign. So those two, ancient and foreign, get equated quite a lot, which is, of course, a problem. And you'll see also from the layout here, so this is just a kind of a random plate in the catalog. You'll see from layout, this really reflects, I think, the way it was displayed in the Wallace Collection as well. This is a display in book form, essentially. They're every plate, so the way the book is structured is it's a plate like this, and then on the back you've got a few short lines to describe what's on it, usually just point by point, essentially, as you would in a gallery. And that's basically it in terms of scholarship. It's pretty light on scholarship. And I'm not the only one who kind of thinks that, because in 1880, this book comes out, which is a description of Indian and Oriental armor by Wilbraham Edgerton. And it's based mostly on the arms and armor at the India office, which later went to the South Kensington Museum, which of course became the V&A later. So that's kind of where all that material is now. And in his introduction, which is substantial, he really laments this sense of there are no good books out there. All these catalogs exist, but they only show pictures. They never say anything about the works. So he essentially goes out and wants to solve that problem. So his text is, well, it is, I say text because it very much is a text, is based on a narrative and then has kind of images or drawings kind of interspersed in between. So it really flips around the idea of what it means to be a catalog. First you have the a display with explanation, and here you have kind of a text with illustrations. And that's, you know, there's only 30 years apart. But I think it's a very interesting way how kind of the way of thinking about Arms and Armour really changes over that time period. And he is much more explicit about the distinction between European and non-European arms armor. And this is Indian Oriental Armor, his title. And he organizes it essentially by, by racial category. So he starts with, so he makes that kind of distinction between Europe and non-Europe much more explicit. And he starts with, he presents the objects essentially as stages of human development. So he starts with the Aboriginal and non-Aryan tribes of Central India and the Andaman Islands. That's kind of his first section. And then the last section is the one that he identifies as the most advanced. So he talks about the demographics which are, he perceives to be the most Aryan. So northwestern India, Afghanistan and Iran. So it's a really kind of, it really fits into the kind of 1880s way of thinking about the world. And this structural move away from the decorative qualities of Arms and Armour towards a more ethnographic approach, it's also this seen in the way it's laid out. So you can see how the plates are not at all the focal part of the catalogue. And another significant innovation that is introduced in this catalogue is the association between Arms and Armour Arms and Armour with military history. And he introduces the catalogue with quite a long, I think 60 or 70 pages of an overview of the military history of India. And that's something that hadn't really been done before, but it is copied a lot. And it's essentially I would say almost the norm in Arms and Armour books now, is to kind of relate it to military history, which is not a given, I think, and hadn't been done before. And of course, he published this during really the height of British imperialism. I mean, this first edition came out around the time of the Second Anglo-Afghan War, and the catalogue itself is, of course, very much a product of its time, but it really sets the tone for subsequent Arms and Armour scholarship, especially for the books that are published kind of in the first half of the 20th century, so including the most recent, but also the only catalogue of the Wallace Collection. So as you can see, an update is long overdue. So I'm very pleased that we almost have that finished. So given this kind of, in my opinion, quite disturbing history of Arms and Armour as a field of study, it is, I think, worth asking, is it relevant? Like, should we study Arms and Armour as a very specific field? Are we maybe better off including it with metalwork or with jewelry? These are, I think, questions that are worth asking. But in my opinion, and I would say that, I think it is still relevant as a category. And I think there are two reasons for that. The first of these is that while the conceptual borders around what exactly is Arms and Armour, they are historically variable, of course. And sometimes it sits closer with decorative arts, as we saw with the Mary collection, and then sometimes it sits closer with to more an ethnographic approach, like with Edgerton. The objects that typically sit under this umbrella, I think, are undeniably really remarkable, really significant, and they have a very specific cultural importance. Arms and Armour have been understood as a distinct category, I think, for essentially all of recorded history. And I think, and they've been so important to people's lives in a way that I think we kind of underestimate, maybe as 21st century people, in the sense that we really live in an age where people don't have weapons on them all the time, when for most of human history that was the norm, and having a weapon would be almost like having a mobile phone today. It's just something that's kind of quintessentially with you, and therefore important. So that's my first kind of reason for thinking it's still a relevant category. The second reason is that maintaining this kind of arms and armor grouping, distinct from metalwork, for example, more generally, is that it also allows us to conceptualize arms and armor and think about it, how does it work as a category? And what I think is or the way I like to conceptualize it, and the way I think is very fruitful to scholarship, is as a kind of architecture of the self. Arms and armor historically sits on a very interesting continuum, I think, of visual self-fashioning, where on the one extreme you've got kind of monumental architecture, you've got the Taj Mahal, Naqsh Jahan Square, all these huge projects by important rulers that really show who they are, what they stand for, show their might, their grandeur, all of that. And it's very public, but it's maybe a little depersonalized. When you see the Taj Mahal, you don't see Shah Jahan specifically. So that's one end of the scale. And then the other end of the scale, you've got very personal things like jewelry, like clothing, which are very intimately associated with someone. You only see them kind of when they're being worn. When you see Shah Jahan wearing a certain article of dress, you're seeing Shah Jahan. It's very difficult to separate the two. But of course, this is a much more private setting. Even when it's kind of court ceremony, it's still very much a smaller audience. So Arms and Armor, I think, sits kind of in a halfway point. Maybe not halfway, but at least somewhere on the continuum where you don't have this kind of privacy or intimacy that you have with jewelry and clothing, because Arms and Armor is really only worn on certain occasions. In your own room without anyone around, you're not going to wear your full suit of armor. It's really something for very ritualized spaces, very, including a battlefield actually, very kind of public space where people are going to see you and people are expecting a kind of a visual language to come from you. You are portraying something very explicitly. But of course it does maintain that kind of intimate link with the wearer by being worn that you don't have with monumental architecture. And I think if we conceptualize Arms and Armor like that, as a kind of architecture of the self, we have to expand the category a little bit, and we include, I think, very interesting objects like crowns and like scepters in that category, which I think makes the study of Arms and Armor more interesting rather than less interesting. And it also forces us to make a very clear distinction between fine arms and armor and kind of regular weapons, the type of arms and armor. So on the one hand, the type of arms and armor that you'd find at a place like the Wallace Collection or the al-Athar, of course, and then on the other hand, kind of the mundane tools of war. And making this distinction would really bring it more in line with art history more general, where, of course, it's very immediately obvious that the study of Ming porcelain is very different from the study of kind of run-of-the-mill earthenware. So I think I would argue that such a distinction must also be made for Arms and Armor. Now, this is really great, but I'm going to talk about that in a second. I do gallery tours quite a lot at the Wallace Collection, as you can imagine, and one of the questions I most frequently get asked is it real? Which I think is a very strange question to ask in a museum, because obviously all of it is real. But I think what people often mean, and children are often a bit more kind of specific about this, they always ask, like, is there still blood on it, or something like that. What people mean is, was this ever used for fighting? Was it ever used for kind of with a dagger, like for stabbing? Were the guns ever fired? Was it used for war? That kind of thing. And I want to kind of deconstruct that question a little bit, because I think it overlooks so many uses of arms and armor that are not captured by fighting. My go-to comparison for an object, like a fine work of arms and armor like this, is it's almost like an expensive watch or an expensive car. Obviously, a car it has that kind of prestige, but if it doesn't go very fast, if your Ferrari can only do 60 miles an hour, like the whole prestige collapses. And it's similar with an expensive watch. You don't buy it just to tell the time, because all kinds of things can do that. But if it can't tell the time, it's a terrible watch. And the prestige value of the whole thing kind of collapses. So it's very similar, I think, with Arms and Armour, where you have this prestige value, and you've got this beautiful gold inlay, as here, for example. But if it doesn't work as a dagger, it doesn't work as a prestige object. And so the use of Arms and Armour should be considered a lot more widely than just stabbing, slashing, shooting. But also just having it on your belt and impressing the people around you, showing how important you are by having these really expensive objects on you. And so that's kind of one part. The other one thing that I want to kind of say about Arms and Armour before we start looking at the individual objects is that every object is essentially a composite object. And I think it's something that makes it very interesting. And this is one of the objects where it's fun, I think, to point that out. Because here we have a steel blade, which is almost certainly the oldest part of the object. And it is late 15th century. It's actually dated. There's a small date here. I'll show you a better picture of the inscription later. So it's the oldest part. It's dated late 15th century, and it's set in a hilt, which not very well, I should add, which is probably a little later. It's stylistically quite consistent, but it doesn't fit very well. It's also it's been cut slightly at a second kind of cutting to kind of fit. And I think what's quite important to note is that the gold, while still being very fine, is significantly less fine than that on the blade. So probably, we think maybe a few decades later. And then you've got a collar here and a scabbard, of course. And you can see the collar here removed. These parts of the objects are early 19th century Russian, so they have essentially nothing to do with it. But this is typically how you find fine, rare Arms and Armour, is every time something breaks, or maybe if it just goes out of fashion, it gets replaced. And sometimes you end up with something that almost doesn't resemble what it is supposed to be, essentially, or what it was originally was. You see also here the hilt has been kind of cut back to accommodate the collar, which was added in the 19th century. So we don't actually really know, because we have very few comparable objects, whether it had a guard of any kind, or a collar indeed, or whether or what it would have looked like if it did have one. Here are some more images of the blade. This is the inscription. It's a little more clear now. Here's the date. It's in 904 in the Hijri calendar, so corresponding to 1498 or 1499 in the Christian calendar. And then it consists of 2 half lines of Persian and then an Arabic aphorism in the middle. I don't know if you can read that from there. And this is the back of the blade. So actually very different, and it creates a very clear front and back, a very clear, like, this is the side that's going to be shown, it's going to be displayed, people can enjoy and see this. And then, I mean, I wouldn't want to call this kind of austere, but it's certainly kind of a less gold, less impressive maybe back. And what is important to realize here is that this inlay is very much, artistically very much in line with contemporary manuscript painting, for example. Many of the motifs you see here, you see also on carpets and on ceramics and on a whole range of other art objects. But it's important to stress that this is not something that's influenced by manuscript painting or carpets or any of these other categories, but rather this fits into a similar, or it fits into the same tradition. And the people who would have designed this are the same people, essentially, who would have designed the carpets or the manuscripts. So not designed by the armorer, which I think is quite an important distinction. Quite often people assume that the armorer just makes everything, or the bladesmith makes everything, which is clearly not the case here. This is the work of a goldsmith. So this is a fairly simple object, actually, compared to some of the other ones. But still, essentially three time periods. When we look at the next object, or next 2 objects, this is a very, very interesting object, I think, because it, again, consists of multiple individual parts. You've got the blade, which is the earliest part, and it's probably either Iranian or Ottoman, a kind of middle of the 16th century, inlaid with gold. It's got 4 lines of poetry. 3 of them in Turkish and 1 of them in Persian. And that's the oldest part. But then it's set in a hilt, which to those who are a little bit more familiar with Arms and Armour will look very Indian. It's a very traditional kind of 18th century. You see them slightly earlier, but not very much. And then you see them throughout the 19th century. It's often called a pistol grip hilt. And whenever anyone looks at it, it's also, oh, that's Indian, that's Indian. It's kind of without even looking more closely. But what I find really interesting is that the decorative pattern on it, the flowers that are kind of carved and then outlined with gold, they form part of a very Ottoman visual language. And they've got either tulips in there, which is a flower that you wouldn't normally see in Indian carving. And it's all done in a very Ottoman way, which leads me to think that this is actually not an Indian hilt, or may originally have been an Indian hilt, but it's then been recarved in the Ottoman Empire and then added to the blade, presumably. And if that is the case, it's probably contemporary with the scabbard, which is definitely Ottoman, very much a kind of typical of the late 18th century, maybe even the early 19th century, in the Ottoman Empire. And they could very well be contemporary to each other, if that is indeed the case. But then presumably a recarved piece of jade, at least inspired by Indian jade. So I think a very interesting kind of range of cultures and backgrounds. And also I think a good reason to, when you set up a catalog, when I set up this catalog, to group India, Iran, the Ottoman Empire together, because so many of these objects get kind of they pick and mix and add certain parts of one object to certain parts of other objects. We don't get that as dramatically here with this gun, but I did want to kind of highlight it because I think there are some very interesting components. So this barrel is either from Safavid Iran or the Mughal Empire, and it's probably 17th century. Actually, makes it quite an early gun, but it's mounted on a stock which is from China, and almost certainly late 18th century, when the Chinese emperor, the Qing Empire, had just conquered Tibet, just conquered Central Asia, and was very keen to kind of bring the artistic histories of those areas in its fold. So there was a real craze for Tibetan-style objects in Beijing at the time. And what's quite interesting there is that from a Chinese perspective, from Beijing, it makes sense to think of India as kind of beyond Central Asia, as the next step beyond Central Asia. So what this gun actually does is it marries something from just outside the empire with something that's now inside the empire. And it becomes a very important part of kind of imperial self-fashioning at the Qing court. And in terms of kind of imperial self-fashioning with Arms and Armour, I want to move on to the Mughal court in the 17th century, actually, so a little earlier, early 17th century. We've got here Shah Jahan, or rather Prince Khurram, at least he still is, so his father Jahangir is still in power. Jahangir here, Khurram or Shah Jahan here, and then also Shah Jahan here. And these two paintings depict essentially the same event. It's the 10th of October, 1617, and Prince Khurram had just come back from a military campaign that involved the Deccan and also southern Rajasthan, especially Mewar. So he passes through there. He's victorious, so he comes back, and he's welcomed by his father, the emperor, and given lots of presents, and generally in terms of gold, in terms of stones, in terms of horses, but also the title Shah Jahan, which means King of the World in Persian. So it's a big event, and these two paintings depict that. This one is broadly contemporary to the event, and it's just a portrait, as you can see, and then this is the Padşahnameh, which is a large book now in Windsor, which was commissioned by Shah Jahan kind of later on in his life. And what I find quite interesting is that Shah Jahan rather, he's depicted quite differently, I think, between the two paintings, but what both paintings have in common is that he's wearing a dagger of a very particular shape, quite an unusual shape, although I'm sure many of you in the audience will have seen it, maybe around here. And I don't think kind of the depiction of this dagger is an accident, as it rarely is. But this shape of dagger is something that when we look at other paintings, we often see on people associated with Mewar, either local rajas, local kind of dignitaries, essentially. And what this dagger, by depicting this dagger, essentially the painter, but presumably also the wearer, if he is depicting a real object, is essentially conveying, oh, this now belongs to Shah Jahan. Now this is part of the Mughal Empire. And if we look at this, so this is in the Wallace Collection, and it's difficult to say with absolute certainty that this is the dagger that is depicted in the paintings, but a few details that I think are really unusual and appear both in the paintings and on our dagger is the fact that it's got a duck's head. If we go back, you can kind of see it. It's very difficult to see. Even kind of enlarging the image doesn't really... I saw this painting in person, and it's possible to see it. It's very difficult to see it on a digital reproduction. So that's a kind of a commonality. And then also the fact that it connects. So typically, daggers of this form kind of end here with a horse head in terms of the dagger here. And in other daggers, essentially, it's often quite like the knuckle guard doesn't go all the way up. It often also stops even just halfway. So those are two interesting details, I think, that I haven't seen on any other objects, but have seen on this, and then seen on both of those paintings. And of course, kind of stylistically, it's very much kind of in line with early 17th century Mughal goldsmith work. And of course, it's incredibly luxurious. I think we have almost 2,000 gemstones in just the hilt here. Unfortunately, we don't have the original scabbard, so that's kind of sad, I think. And so I hope this kind of conveys the architecture of the self idea. This is clearly something you don't wear when you're just kind of privately. This is something you wear at very important occasions, like coming back from a military campaign. And by wearing it, you convey exactly what you achieved on that campaign. And I think there are a few details, apart from the form, which I pointed out is more of a southern form that wasn't really that popular at the Mughal court prior to this campaign. There's another really interesting feature, I think, and one that I quite enjoy in the context of architecture on itself, because it's quite literally an architectural feature. You can see here a pattern. If you start with the ruby, it's the easiest to see. And you can see a star with points. And then if you look at the gold that surrounds the emeralds, you can see that it's kind of an 8-pointed star. And that pattern is a pattern that's very popular kind of across, especially Iran, Central Asia. It also gets used in North India. Here we have the tomb of Itzma ad-Dawla in Agra. And you can see it here. It's not the same pattern, but it draws from that. It makes it a little bit more complex, makes it a little bit more interesting visually. And that's recreated here as well. So I think it's very befitting of someone who styles himself from this point onwards as the king of the world to use styles and patterns from a variety of different parts of the world, and especially parts of the world that he lays claim to as future emperor. So if we move on to the next, I now want to talk a little bit, so I've talked about the dagger, I want to talk a little bit also about Arms and Armour as devotional object, which I mentioned earlier. And that kind of takes us out of Arms and Armour as kind of personal objects. It takes us out of the idea of the kind of the court ceremony, all of that. And the example that I want to use, what I want to use to kind of illustrate this is 19th century ta'ziya performances in Iran. We have lots of records for that, which makes it, I think, quite an interesting subject. Although these performances, which are held during the month of Muharram by Shi'i Muslims, have been going on at least dating back as far back as the 16th or maybe early 17th century. And they commemorate the martyrdom of Hussein, the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad, who died at the Battle of Karbala in Iraq. So the origins of this play, they're a bit obscure, but certainly by the middle of the 19th century, I think that's what's important, is that it's a fully fledged tradition, full of kind of quite strict rules about exactly what's going on. So very ritualized kind of environment. And it is so important at this point to kind of Iranian society that purpose-built theaters start popping up. And this is kind of the grandest example. This is Taqiyya Dawla in Tehran. And unfortunately, it doesn't exist anymore because it was demolished in the early 20th century. And here we have some pictures of kind of today's performances of these plays, contemporary performances. And you can see immediately how important Arms and Armour is. It's a as I mentioned, a reenaction of a battle. So one would, I think, expect armor. And we can also clearly see that these are not armors that are meant for actual fighting. There's no actual fighting going on here. It is clearly exclusively kind of a reenactment. Although one would assume, especially in the earlier days, kind of prior to the 19th century, that people just wore the armor that they would have worn in battle. So this again blurs the line between kind of maybe ceremonial arms and armor, which is a term I try to avoid using, but which get used quite a lot, and authentic or real arms and armor. And we can see also here that this is very much out of the kind of the context of kind of personal self-fashioning or kind of the court. And here are two objects which are associated with these taziyah performances and the kind of the other mourning rituals around it. On the left is a helmet, which I think is quite obvious. But then on the right, we have one half of a standard. So this is kind of a battlefield standard originally. And during Muharram, these get carried around during processions that also kind of commemorate the death of Hussein. And I think that, again, using a battlefield standard is something that maybe we don't necessarily associate with arms and armor as a field of study. I occasionally go to museums where these kinds of objects are kind of separate from the arms and armor, so they're in the, kind of the metalwork section as if they have nothing to do with arms and armor, but quite clearly not just from a kind of usage point of view, but also from a technical point of view. They actually have a lot in common. It's a little bit more clear here, I think, with the pierced work. You can very much see how these are from similar workshops. It's similar people making similar objects, and this is also an element of a religious standard. This one's supposed to be a little older, although it's quite difficult to date, I think, in general. So what's also quite interesting is that despite this helmet having very clear religious Shi'i Muslim usage, this was made by a Christian armor in the Armenian quarter of Isfahan. So again, kind of problematizes the idea of kind of Islamic arms and armor as kind of a very clear kind of set area. And so before my time runs out, I just want to share quite a fun discovery I made on this armor. So the armor has 6 cartouches. I've only highlighted 3 here so you can see kind of what's going on. And 4 of those cartouches are in Persian. They've got beautiful Persian inscriptions. And then 2 of them, these 2, have Armenian. And they're essentially a direct translation of the Persian text, or the other way around. It's basically the same text. You can see, for example, here, Huwa, which of course refers to God. And then that's here. It's actually, this is the word for is, but the he is implied. So it's kind of, it's the same concept, but translated to an Armenian context. And what's very interesting is that this gives the date of the manufacture of the object, which is the year 1260 in the Hijri calendar, of course, which corresponds to 1844 or 1845. And then in the Armenian inscription, we find text. We find the same text, essentially saying something like during the reign of Muhammad Shah, king of the Persians, and then it says in the year of the Lord, and then it says nothing. And I thought that was really odd because the Persian one gives the date. So why doesn't the Armenian one give the date? I think that's very strange. So I looked at it really closely, and maybe some of you have already seen it, but it took me a while. So bear with me. But if you look closely here, you can see 1844. Kind of erased in the text. So someone, at some point, and we can pin it down quite precisely when, decided that having 1844 in numerals that a European could read is not very beneficial to selling it in Europe. because this was on the market in the 1860s, more or less. And, you know, you're an antiquities collector or, you know, someone who's around to collect valuable objects. You don't want something that was made in the last 2 decades. So what I think is that a dealer keen to sell it for, or present it as much older than it actually is, decided, nah, they can't read the Persian. That's fine. I'm not going to do anything with that. But I am going to erase this little date that they can read, and then presumably present it as maybe 17th century or something like that. So, and yeah, of course, safe in the knowledge that someone like the 4th Marquess of Hertford, who acquired this, wouldn't be able to read that. And yeah, I think that's really fun. You can also see actually that here, the same kind of blank space that you have here, well, would be blank space, is covered with a little illustration, which again makes it very suspicious that there was nothing here. So I just wanted to share that, and I hope you enjoyed this. And you know, if you have any questions, please ask them.